Colonel Beaver, let me start with you. In September of 2002, behavioral scientists and interrogators from Guantanamo attended training at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And on September 25th, 2002, less than a week after they got back from training, Jim Haynes, David Addington, John Rizzo, and Michael Chertoff traveled to Guantanamo, where you were the senior JAG officer. A week later, on October 2nd, Jonathan Fredman, the chief counsel of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, came down to Gitmo and attended a meeting with you where SEER techniques were discussed. That's October 2nd. Now, tab 7 in your book are the minutes from that meeting. On page 3 of the minutes, Mr. Fredman is quoted as saying that the anti-torture statutes are vaguely written and that, quote, it is basically subject to perception. If the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong. According to the minutes, you said we'll need documentation to protect us. If the aggressive techniques were legal, why would you need protection?
This email was not written by me, so I can't account for its accuracy except that somebody from the Criminal Investigation Task Force wrote it. But separate from that, regarding Jonathan Fredman participating in a meeting that I held, I had held a number of meetings to discuss interrogation techniques once the military intelligence personnel wanted to do more aggressive techniques. So I thought it was in the best interest of all concerned that everyone participate in meetings, including the law enforcement community, to understand where everybody was coming from. CITF was invited and did participate. I don't remember what Mr. Fredman said, nor do I remember what I said specifically, but certainly when, in terms of requesting additional techniques, I can only think that what I was referring to was these techniques were not contained in the Army Field Manual, and they were not contained in an approved manual of some sort that was recognized by the services. So in terms of obtaining command approval, I believe I was referring to just that these techniques, whatever was going to be recommended by the MI community, would need to be approved by the appropriate authority because they weren't already techniques that were trained and taught at Fort Huachuca and contained in the Army Field Manual.
Well, what was the reference to protection? You said if the... Well, why would you need... Well, first of all, did you say we'll need documentation to protect us, and what were you referring to? Legal opinion?
Again, this is not my email,
right.
So I can't say with certainty I said that.
All right. What about Mr. Fredman's statement? Do you remember him saying if the detainee dies, you're doing it wrong?
I do not recall anything I mean, it's 6 years ago, so I just honestly cannot recall what was specifically said. What I thought was valuable in terms of his contribution was bringing another view so that others besides myself, in terms of my colleagues in that room, could listen to another person essentially discuss the torture convention and so forth, and that you could have an open discussion about this. And so I recall that we did have a good discussion, and that it was collegial and that everyone participated. That's basically what I recall from that meeting.
Now, on page 4 of those minutes, you are quoted as asking, does SEER employ the wet towel technique? Do you remember discussing the SEER techniques? Well,
I remember the J2 at the time, Lieutenant Colonel Jerry Pfeiffer, had brought up the wet towel technique, and so I'd certainly, I'd never seen waterboarding. I still haven't as of today. I've never seen any kind of wet towel technique, and so that was one of the things that the, Defense Intelligence Agency personnel and military intelligence personnel wanted to request, and I believe I was asking about that because I had not ever seen that myself.
Your reference to does SEER employ the wet towel technique, is that an accurate reference?
I can say I probably did. I don't remember specifically, but I know that that was one of the techniques that the interrogators had raised as something that they might wish to employ.
And do you remember discussion about SEER techniques being used?
The what I remember about SEER being discussed was the fact that that if something was going to be approved by a higher command, which I thought in this case would be General Hill, I had really no idea it would go higher than General Hill, that you would then have to have an SOP, standard operating procedure. You would have to have people trained. You would have to do all the kinds of things to ensure that techniques were used properly and they would not go beyond what was lawful. And so because SEER already had SOPs on many of these types of techniques, I know I certainly thought if something got approved, again, a technique that SEER used, that could be a good starting point for an SOP. So it made sense if somebody were already doing it, is all I'm saying. And so we could not employ these techniques without the proper training and controls.
Were you aware of the fact that the SEER program was to be used defensively and not offensively against detainees? Were you aware of that?
Yes, sir.
So why would you be talking about SEER techniques in terms of interrogation, since its purpose was not an interrogation purpose?
From my intelligence colleagues who were looking to do basically, or who said, including General Dunleavy, who was insistent that the detainees were showing signs of being counter-resistance trained, they were looking for additional techniques. And because the President had determined that the Geneva Conventions did not apply, that they were not to be treated as POWs, then in the world of, I guess, what, this is my own words, or makes sense to me, if you know there might be something out there that's within the military community that might be found to be legal, it wasn't determined yet, but might be found to be legal, then they would look to that, because they already understood that things that were illegal, of course, like torture, was illegal. Of course they weren't going to ask for something like that. And so you look to something that's already being done that you can, as opposed to creating something new that's never been done. So I have to assume, because most people know a SEER, or have some even at Gitmo had been trained, that was a natural sort of jump to maybe some of the SEER techniques, not all of them, would be permissible and would be effective. And so they reached out to SEER. And the only people who had psychologists were the SEER people. And so our psychologists who weren't trained in that, except in human behavior, also I think it was a natural leap for them to think, well, perhaps my colleagues at the SEER school in behavioral psychology might be helpful to me.
Well, you call a natural leap, though, but you were aware that, as a matter of fact, it was exactly the reverse purpose.
No, I understand what you're saying, Senator Levin.
But were you aware of it at the time when you talked about SEER techniques?
Well,
well, wait a minute.
Yes, sir.
That the purpose of those techniques being used was to inoculate our troops, and that these were students that were being trained to be prepared for the application of those Geneva violative techniques against them. Were you aware of all that? And yet you call that a natural leap when the purpose was exactly the opposite purpose of what that program is intended to provide?
Sir, later I became aware of much of this. At the time, General Dunleavy did not include me in these conversations. The people he sent to the SEER school at North Carolina was not in any conversation I was involved in. So I'm just posturing what I think my colleagues thought about when they're thinking, if again, an interrogation technique that might be useful that SEER employs, go to the SEER school and check it out for ourselves. I'm just, again, saying that on behalf of my colleagues.
Were you surprised that neither the General Counsel of the Department of Defense nor any of the staff there produced a written legal analysis for General Dunleavy's request?
When I can only speak from the military chain of command up to Jane Dalton, Rear Admiral, sorry, retired Jane Dalton. I tried to get help from Manny Superville, Colonel Manny Superville, the staff judge advocate at Southcom, and he was silent on my request. In fact, I reached him at the golf course our Columbus Day weekend, which is a 4-day holiday for Southcom, and spoke to him and said, I'm sending up this draft. I really need your help. There was no response. And at some point, and I can't say what date, I talked to Captain Dalton and asked for her help. and she told me that I needed to speak to Colonel Superville, which of course I said I did, and he wouldn't help. So I basically understood I was on my own, as it were, regarding the military.